The United States has just celebrated Earth Day with a large outpouring of concern about the environment, a lot of people demonstrating and talking about the environment. We're very fortunate on Alternative Views today to have John Milton with us. If you haven't heard of John Milton, well, you should have, because he is one of the originals talking about the environment and doing something about the environment all around the world. He's one of the founders of Friends of the Earth. He's written 8 or 9 books about the environment. As an ecologist, he actually wrote the first basic book on the environment called The Future Environments in North America. And another one of his many books is called The Careless Technology, the results of what happens when the World Bank and some of those people go in and have these different operations and different constructions, which particularly in the third world. John also has set up ecological activist coalitions around the world. And he's set up national parks all over the world. And, well, gosh, if I continued on talking about what he's done, it cuts into the time we have to talk with him. So, John, we're really pleased that you're going to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And that you flew in all the way from Colorado to be with us.
Thank you.
What we want to do is to have a general overall survey of all the ecological problems that face us, and then talk about what is being done, what we can do, and whether it's too late or not, and also who is responsible for the environmental problems which we have right now. Well, you're a specialist in the rainforest particularly. You've been all over the Amazon and in many parts of the world, but is the rainforest destruction really as bad as what they say?
If anything, I think it's a little worse than what you generally hear in the media. And one of the things that astounds me is that we're now calculating that within the next 10 years, most of the rainforest left in Southeast Asia, which had one of the most diverse rainforests anywhere in the world, it contains somewhere between 50 and 60% of all the species that are found in the tropics. That forest will be virtually eliminated within the next 10 years.
And what is causing that? Is it an aftermath of Vietnam and the Indochina wars or economic development?
Part of that is involved in the sense that the whole movement of industrialization into that part of the world began to happen at that time. But there's so many players now from so many different countries that are beginning to move into the Southeast Asian picture that one of the major players, for example, has become Japan. And just as you both, I'm sure, are quite aware of the role of the Japanese in causing everything from the killing of tuna, overfishing in Alaskan waters, tremendous devastation in terms of the ocean environment. In the same way, they've been a major factor in the destruction of the tropical forests of Indonesia, Malaysia, and very recently began to move into Burma. Now, Burma is a country that, because it's been so closed off from the outside world, and because there's been a war going on between the tribes in the north and the government down in Rangoon in the south, Burma has effectively remained closed to development interests from the outside. The Japanese just recently negotiated a contract to go in there and do massive deforestation of the teak forests and the rainforests of Burma for the first time. And that was the last place we had in Southeast Asia that we felt, at least in Burma, those great forests would be protected. And if there was a chance for the reforestation of many of the other countries, at least Burma would be a pool out of which the reforestation could occur. Now, even that is up in the air because of this Japanese initiative.
Now, they say that and the multinational corporations in the various countries say that they want the raw materials for the industrialized countries in order to use. So this is why they're doing it, and they say that it's worth the price. What is the price?
Of these raw materials?
No, of destroying the
destruction. Destroying the rainforest.
Right.
Well, that's the whole problem with the economic system that we've got. There is basically all of the environmental costs are not factored in. Virtually all of them are not factored in when it comes to the way that the cost-benefit ratios are calculated in classical economic theory. When you do a cost-benefit ratio, in general, the air, the water, the genetic value of the genetic pool of resources that's involved, all of these kinds of things have no value whatsoever. They're not factored in any way. Another problem with the way in which we work our economics with the living web of the planet is that, by and large, the cost-benefit ratio tends to favor, particularly if you have a high discount rate, it tends to favor very rapid consumption and utilization of resources in the near-term future to make a profit as quickly as possible. This allows you to pay off the discount rate, to pay off the interest quickly.
To the banks. Or
yes. And if that is a higher rate, then of course you want to do it even faster. This means that you basically, in a cost-benefit ratio, which balances the costs and the benefits, in most cases, because you're running to make that profit and to pay back the banks or whatever the loan institution may be, most of the costs, most of the impacts are very, very long-term costs. And yet you may get the loss of an entire ecosystem or devastating floods in the Ganges that wipe out the homes and the livelihood for millions of people. But in the near term, you might get 2 or 3 years of productive agriculture up in the hills before everything starts to wash away. In terms of the cost-benefit ratio, it makes sense to go ahead and plant those 2 or 3 years of crops, make that profit, and forget about what happens 20 years down the road. It doesn't matter, because that's so far down the road in terms of the cost-benefit ratio that it comes out in the ratio as a very tiny little figure. Isn't that amazing? And that's the way our decision-making is made in terms of the environment.
We frequently read about and hear about Brazil and what is happening there. Terrible destruction, not only of the rainforest, but of people and their culture. Vicious massacres of the Indians, native populations. In addition to this, I've read some really scary things, that because this is the enormous rainforest produce the oxygen which we breathe, as being recirculated around the world. I mean, is it really possible that the world could run out of oxygen because of the depletion of these rainforests?
It could certainly enter into a major, it could be a major contribution in the depletion of the oxygen on the planet. The oceans also play a major role in this.
But also in rain, in
every way.
Rain.
In every way.
This could cause perhaps could cause droughts around the world and famine.
A good example of this, and people don't generally realize this, but the tropical zones are acting like a huge weather generator. If you go into the Amazon basin, it's amazing, because those rains start out in the Atlantic Ocean and they start rolling across the Amazon basin in a great rolling wave of weather. And as it moves across the Amazon basin, and you have the rainfall, which then of course nurtures the rainforest, the rain comes down, and then approximately 75 to 80% of that rainfall is immediately evapotranspired back into the atmosphere. Only something like 20% of it goes back into the river systems. And then much of that actually gets pulled out by the roots again and also recirculated. So perhaps only something like 10% of that moisture actually goes back out to the Atlantic via the Amazon. All the rest of it moves in a tremendous rolling wave of moisture and humidity that goes all the way across the Amazon, waters it, and then moves to the north and the south to water Venezuela, and down to, in the case of, to the north to water Venezuela, and to the south to water the Argentine, the Chilean territory. As it moves to the south, it waters in particular some of the very fertile lands that we have down in northern Argentina in particular. It is virtually the major weather generator for the entire breadbasket of that part of South America, which is probably the most productive area in South America. It was interesting when a series of multinational agricultural corporations moved into southern Brazil and Argentina and Chile. They saw that there was very, very rich land in that part of the world. They decided they wanted it. So they developed a scheme in collusion with the Brazilian government to basically buy out the settlers the people that had farmed that land, the small farmers that had done a real good job for hundreds of years in that really rich agricultural land. They worked out a deal with the Brazilian government to build roads with World Bank and AID money from our country, and then provided very attractive sounding 160 plus hectare pieces of land in the Amazon rainforest, not telling anybody that that soil is only cultivatable for a few years, and then it becomes infertile.
Gosh. So infertile forever, or can it be retrieved?
Infertile forever under conventional agricultural techniques. And not only that, it often becomes hard laterite and becomes a desert. But that's another story. The point is that they basically had a forced exodus of millions of people from this zone to the south, which then settled the Amazon, or big hunks of the Amazon, deforested vast areas. The multinationals ended up with a good agricultural soil in the south that was not subject to the heavy leaching and loss of agricultural nutrients and soil nutrients that you find in the tropics. And the people that used to live on that land ended up with soil which then produced for 1, 2, 3 years, did quite well. And then suddenly they began to find that their protein yields went down. Then they found that their overall yield, just the amount of biomass, the amount of agricultural material that they could grow, period, began to drop. And then suddenly they found they could hardly grow a thing. Because the leaching of, when you have an agricultural system that's put into a rainforest, the original system there is a very complex, multi-tiered rainforest that basically has many strata to the forest. And so you have high trees, deep root systems, broad root systems, then layers underneath that with different networks of roots down into the soil, and then an herbaceous layer with, again, a whole other network of roots. When the leaves fall, because of the high temperatures, they break down very fast. They break down into soluble nutrients. High rainfall, high temperature. Those nutrients very quickly get leached down into the soil and immediately picked up by those root systems and recirculated back up into the living system. So most of the fertility of the rainforest is literally in the living organic system. It's amazing. When you cut that forest, of course, the first thing that happens is you go in and you plant your crops, but it doesn't. The network of roots only covers a very shallow area on the surface. Plus, there are many areas where there's no crop at all. Lots of spaces in between. So, after a couple of years of rainfall, under those high temperatures and high rainfall, the nutrients start getting leached deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Meanwhile, what's left of the old roots of the old rainforest system begin to go and die off. Soon there's nothing left to capture those nutrients, and they're lost forever eventually. They go down into the earth. Then if you continue with your insanity, your agricultural insanity, what often happens is that soil becomes a rock-hard laterite, which means that it binds and becomes literally as hard as rock. You have to take a pickaxe to it to break it up.
So you can't then replenish it in any way?
Then it's very difficult for roots to get anything down into it. It becomes baked.
And this is already happening as a result of the destruction.
Exactly.
Over what expanse?
Oh.
Is it massive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Last year, I remember the reports we had from the rainforest were something like, they were reporting between 50 and 100,000 fires burning, major fires burning, just in the Amazon alone, as the Amazon was being cleared. And the paradox and the tragedy of this is that those people who are the victims, the people that are being brought into that territory, the whole motivation was to give the land away cheap to these multinational corporations that bought it out further south, where you don't have those high temperatures and where you don't have that heavy leaching because of the high rainfall and high temperatures.
John,
somewhat like our own Midwest.
You'd mentioned the devastating effect this would have on all of Latin America if the rainforest dries up, because the weather from that goes, as you said, throughout the continent.
Right.
What effect does it have in a more global dimension in terms of global warming trends or affecting weather patterns that go to the United States, Europe, and the entire world? Is it a big impact on that as well?
Yeah, definitely, because basically in the same way that we were talking about that rolling mass of moisture that moves across the Amazon, other things happen. When you destroy the rainforest, you destroy the entire weather generator for the countries to the north and the countries to the south, which means you basically eliminate the rainfall base. for Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Ecuador, and so on. It doesn't just affect the Amazon basin, it affects that entire area. In addition, just like an air conditioning unit, when you remove all the vegetation, all the transpiration and evaporation that's occurring, and you leave behind a kind of hot, desertic kind of environment, you completely change the rate at which the upwelling occurs of hot air along the equatorial belt and the related sub-equatorial belts, because they're being deforested too. That means that the whole weather generation system, which basically depends upon a particular rate of the lifting of hot air up from the equator and its descent again further north, all of that has a very powerful effect on wind patterns, on rainfall distribution, and so on. All of that gets totally disrupted. All of our crops are all over the world are entirely dependent upon a stable weather distribution pattern. If you change that, suddenly the trees can't live because they're not getting enough rainfall, or it starts getting too hot or too cold. You basically introduce massive destabilization into global environments in totally unpredictable ways. It's much more serious than just the loss of oxygen, which is serious. But the main thing that I feel is the issue is the total destabilization of world climate. And when you think that just a loss in our Midwest, let's say if we had an average reduction of 5 inches of rainfall a year, that's it. You've got a southwestern desert.
Back to the Dust Bowl.
Yeah. And we're at the same time, we're running out of we've already mined all the water out of the Oglala aquifer in the high plains. So there's no fossil water to fall back on because we've already wasted that, and we're poisoning what little is left with fertilizers and artificial fertilizers. So we're left with a situation where I can see that directly impacting our American breadbasket.
And already it's happening.
It's already happening.
Well, you see these documentaries or news stories about how the water is disappearing from out west because the big farms are using it up. This is just another one of the ecological disasters, and the aquifer poisoning at the same time.
Right.
Even if we didn't have the problem with with rainforest destruction, what effect would that have on the United States of the aquifer poisoning and the water depletion from overuse?
Well, basically, this country, under the wise and careful custodianship of the Native American peoples, maintained a tremendously rich series of organic systems, ecosystems, and resources, which amaze me when you look at the other parts of the world, like China, most of Asia, really, for that matter, and certainly even of Europe. Tremendously rich organic diversity had been maintained here under the custodianship of the Native Americans.
How did that work? What did they do to preserve these systems?
Well, you know, there's one
or
value.
To produce them, even.
There's one value there that is interesting. We were talking earlier about the cost-benefit ratio, and how basically the cost-benefit ratio says if it doesn't pay back within 2 to 5 years, it's no good. It doesn't matter what the cost is further down the road. That's just a tiny little thing. The only thing we care about is what we get back in 2 to 5 years. And that's the fundamental value of this culture that we've got. That's the basic problem right there.
And what did the Native Americans do differently? What
the
was
Native
their
Americans
strategy?
said, we will not make any changes unless we look ahead 7 generations minimum.
Wow.
And we can see that it will be good for that 7th generation. If it will be good for that 7th generation, and for all the other living beings of the earth who are our brothers and our sisters and our mothers and our fathers and our grandfathers and our grandmothers and our cousins, then that change is good and beneficial, and we'll go ahead. That was their basic economics.
And what did they do to preserve the systems in terms of their technologies? It's just that they didn't pollute them. They were cautious as to what waste went in them, or did they actually cultivate the aquifers, digging, irrigation, ditches, or whatever?
There was some, but the basic Native American ethics said that you will respect the skin of Mother Earth. Mother Earth is a living organism, and to go deep into Mother Earth and to take out her lifeblood by trying to mine the water or mine the deep minerals is like doing surgery on your mother when she doesn't need it, when she's perfectly healthy. You know, would you go and take your mother and cut her open and start taking her organs out? Huh? So that was basically their view. And now we might look at that and say, well, this is ridiculous. But, I mean, take a look at what we've done. We've mined out the Oglala aquifer. It's just about dead.
Now, where is that? What's the extent?
The Oglala basically runs from near the Canadian border, and it runs along the whole plains, shortgrass prairie on into the tallgrass prairie country, from up in the Montana country, down through Kansas on into Texas. And it's the major aquifer for the western plains district of the Rocky Mountain region, or just going up to the Rockies. And it was the main water resource that we had, other than the free-flowing river systems themselves. What we have done is come up with, through our technology, an incredibly wasteful system of mining that water and then spreading that water out on the land. No concept of even the most fundamental things like a drip irrigation system, which very carefully meters out just a little bit of water at a time, the minimum you need to keep the agriculture working. Instead, just massive utilization of the water, no cost placed upon the fact that it's a fossil water that's not going to last forever. So basically what we have done is to take the gift of Mother Earth there. We've mined out the fundamental organ system, you might say.
The minerals, you mean, stuff like iron and coal and...
Same thing. Same thing as with water. We've taken the copper, and we've taken the iron, we've taken all the minerals, and just ripped it out of the earth. What happens if there's a breakdown in culture following a major global catastrophe? If there's either some sort of catastrophic war or some major breakdown of the overall structure. We do not have concentrated sources of minerals anymore. It takes a lot of energy to extract those minerals, concentrate them, bring them back together again. But the only source we have are some dumps. And it's an interesting, I think it was Harrison Brown that came up with the thesis that the decline of civilization may be due to the fact that we've already wasted all of the concentrated mineral resources of the planet. If there's ever a major perturbation and breakdown of the basic culture of the planet, human culture, we'll never be able to come and reconcentrate all those mineral resources to achieve any level of technology again, high level of technology. It's an interesting idea.
Well, there's another thing that has happened, and that is soil depletion, not only through erosion, but through chemical fertilizers, not to mention cut and burn tactics in the third world. What's the status of our soil? Of course, it gets blown away during dust storms, too. But we've talked about the water, what about the soil?
Yeah. Well, I should also say, just finishing on the water, that...
Oh, excuse me.
In the case of our Oglala, we basically, it's almost gone. We just have a few years left. Now people are frantically trying to grab water from the Rocky Mountains. LA is just sucking the Colorado dry. The Texas and Colorado are both trying to go into the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado and steal the water away from all of the farmers of that region that have lived there for hundreds of years, and take that water and pipe it into Texas and Colorado in order to bail them out for a few more years. And there's some interest groups that are stand to make several $1 billion off that project. But it will devastate the farming community of southern Colorado, which is already a poor Hispanic community right now, for the most part. Either poor Anglo or poor Hispanic community. Wonderful people, but there's not lots of money. And the only thing they depend upon is their agriculture. That's what they live on. You take that water, you destroy their livelihood, totally. And we're talking now about destroying the few self-reliant agricultural systems we have left, siphoning off water for the cities and for the very wasteful agribusiness farming operations.
Which uses a tremendous amount of water, much more than it's necessary.
Yes, at least the small farmers, by and large, tend to be much more conservative about their use of water. And the same thing with soil. Now, the loss of the water resource is happening everywhere. It's most apparent in the Southwest because there the water resources are very scarce and critical, and so we're coming up to that fine edge much earlier. But it's, of course, happening in a major issue in California, and becoming a major issue even in the well-watered or relatively well-watered East Coast, simply because we've polluted so much and we've wasted so much, even in an incredibly well-watered area.
In fact, let's talk about pollution for a minute before getting to the soil. In 1962, I think it was, Rachel Carson wrote her book, Silent Spring, that was one of the first dramatic documentations of the poisoning of our rivers, our lakes, and the sea through chemical and other industrial pollutants. What has the situation been with pollutants since then? We didn't learn a lesson early on in the early 60s. You also were writing about this topic at that time.
That's right.
And despite the scientific knowledge and awareness that tremendous amounts of pesticides and chemical and industrial pollutants were destroying what was left of our water, these ways continued, did they not?
Absolutely.
And what is the magnitude of this today now, 30 years or so after?
I was just thinking while you were talking, part of the year I lived down in Baja California, conducting wilderness solos, which I believe to be a very powerful form of environmental education, and sort of an opening up to a new kind of philosophy that sees the earth as an organic living being very directly, without any interpretation, just a direct experience of that. But at the end of my work period down there this year, I was in this paradoxical situation. I was working for a group called the Conservation Foundation back in the 60s, and we gave Rachel Carson the first grants to write that book,
I see.
Silent Spring, and supported her work back in those days. And I suddenly found myself being subjected with 10 broad-spectrum applications of malathion in the little agricultural oasis I lived there in Todos Santos. This was about 4 weeks ago. My partners down there, wonderful, one woman from Texas and another wonderful woman from that area herself, had to evacuate. And
Was that when they were spraying for the flies?
for the medfly. See, the medflies,
Because malathion is bad stuff.
it's very bad stuff. It's teratogenic, which means it causes genetic mutations. It causes many different forms of cancer, and it destroys the entire organic base of the natural self-regulating control system for pests. The problem is we're too damn greedy. In most Native American cultures, another ethic was you give something to nature. Everything in nature needs to be taken care of. All beings have equal value, including the insects. So you offer, part of your crop goes to all these different beings. It's just the way of nature. You don't try to take it all. You know? It's like sitting in a family table and mom and dad take, the whole meal. We don't treat our families that way. Why should we treat nature that way? It doesn't make sense. Particularly in an organic system that's totally interconnected. So basically, that's what we're trying to do with our contemporary agricultural systems, our whole approach to the earth and to the resources. I mean, they're not really resources, they're basically our family. And down there, that same sort of greed took over. We banned a lot of that stuff here in the States, like DDT. A lot of that's getting exported into the Latin American countries and into Asia. And I mean, you're getting places that are having 50 to 60 and up to 100 applications of pesticide in a year.
And comes back to us in food then.
We import we import all this stuff too.
But on the malathion issue, the paradox is that we already have the techniques and the approaches. We know that if you use sterile sex attractants, you can attract the fruit flies in to traps, which then move the fruit fly. You can simply do nothing, and the natural wasp population will build up and wipe out the medfly or bring it down to a low level. You don't have to do a thing. Nature will do it. Or, if you want to speed it up a little bit, you can use some of these newer techniques like the release of sterile males. When you swamp the population with a sterile male fruit fly, and basically that brings the population down very radically of the fruit fly. And I guess that was done here in Texas for the screwworm fly very successfully. It doesn't affect any other species.
Rat-eye screwworm fly in the case of the sterile males, I guess.
But in any case, the point being that we have many very biological control alternatives. We are not using these things. And we're certainly not trusting the basic inherent natural controls of nature herself.
And what is the extent of pollution since, say, Rachel Carson's book in the 60s? Is the percentage extent growing dramatically, or is it pretty much the same, or how would you rate it?
Globally?
Let's say in the U.S.
In some areas it's dropped, and in other areas it's increased. We have been able to eliminate some basic pollutants of air and water, like lead. Some of the PCBs have dropped. However, some of the nitrogen-based pollutants have increased. I'd say that we probably have a greater problem of fertilizer contamination of the soil and organic contamination of the groundwater systems than we had 10 years ago or 20 years ago by far. On a global basis, I'd say we're much worse off. Many of the toxic chemicals that we produce here in the United States, as we've developed more environmental consciousness here, we have exported these chemicals through Dow and the other chemical companies. We've exported these things into other parts of the world, and they still want to make their profits, and they do. So they sell them to countries that don't really know what the hell's going on, or don't care. They have governments that do not care.
So ironic also, you know, this also relates to smog and the stuff we breathe, and to things which we eat, which have all these chemical additives and are as a result of the fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Then you add on top of this the fact that the tobacco industry gets export subsidies to sell cigarettes overseas, and they're forcing cigarettes on a lot of countries that don't want them, so that our internal ecology is being fouled, as well as the external environment of the world. What about the soil now? We've talked about the water being bad, chemical fertilizers being bad. We've heard for years about erosion and planting of certain crops which destroy the richness of the soil. What's the status of it?
A few years back, I guess it was around 78, 79, 80, I took a job. I was working as a professor of ecology and regional environment at the University of Colorado College in University of Illinois facility in central Illinois, and took a very deep look at what was happening to the soil of our American Midwest, which is really our basic breadbasket. These are the soils we really depend upon in Illinois and Iowa and places like that. What astounded me was that we were given a birthright in terms of our tenancy of this continent, this Turtle Island, as the Native Americans call it.
Turtle Island?
Turtle Island is the name, the Native American name for North America. Because on one hand, it kind of looks like a turtle if you look at the continent as a whole, but also because the Native Americans saw this incredible continent as riding on the back of a great cosmic turtle that was traveling through the universe. And it was an interesting, in a way, it's their view of, they had, I think, a very clear view of things like continental drift a long time ago. They had different analogies for it, but very perceptive. But in any case, when I went to Illinois, I was amazed. That area, which used to have 36 inches of prime topsoil, do you realize what that is? 36 inches of topsoil? I mean, you talk about wealth. Gold is nothing compared to that. We took that 36 inches, and in less than 100 years, we brought it down to 10 to 18 inches. We wasted between half and two-thirds.
And how does that happen? How do you deplete or waste the soil in that way?
What you do is you introduce a lot of mechanized agriculture. You till a great deal. You till in such a way that you leave the soil exposed We used to have a mixed agricultural system in this country, small farming, mixed agriculture. So there tended to be a broad-scale utilization of many different kinds of crops, and you had animals also as part of the agricultural system as well as the crops. With that, you tended to have recycling of organic manures, which helped soil structure and also protected it.
Crop rotation.
You had crop rotation. You had many techniques in the old days, which made a lot of sense. Many of those techniques were picked up from the Native Americans. The Native Americans were doing a lot of really good things. We should have learned a lot more things from the Native Americans when we first came here. We had closed minds. Linear. We were not looking at the totality. We were not taking a holistic view. We just looked at, okay, we want this, and we're going to get it this way. Real greedy.
Productive outputs and ratios, just trying to produce more in a shorter
Yeah.
time. Also a technological hubris, thinking that big technology is going to produce more and better.
Yeah.
Just like big assembly lines in factories produce more cars or more steel. Likewise, big mechanized farm equipment is going to produce more goods or more food, but it's going to actually destroy and deplete the soil and the nutrients.
True. And what happened in the case of our Midwestern soil is that was definitely part of the picture, but on top of that, we phased out the mixed agricultural system. When you had mixed agriculture, it meant that you basically had to work there year-round, which means you could fine-tune the agricultural cycle to the time of the year. In other words, you could plow just before you planted, or shortly before you planted. With the arising of eliminating animals as part of your crop ecosystem, then when fall came, well, to save some time in the spring, since you had your tractor out there anyway, you went ahead and plowed and maybe you had a cover crop and you plowed that under, and then you just let the soil lie bare until it was time for spring planting. So that meant that the soil laid out there under the winter rains and all the wind erosion for, say, 3 to 4 months out of the year. That one simple change led to most of the soil erosion and loss of our heritage. And why was that? It was because people wanted to take a vacation and go to Florida.
Well, what about agribusiness, though? They're a year-round operation, right?
They, too, tend, since they can't grow in many of these areas in the winter, because it's more efficient from a pure business standpoint to get that edge as close as possible. If you do your plowing in the fall after you've got the last possible crop in, and then you do your plowing, and then you get that crop in as quickly as possible in the spring, as soon as you can get it in there. And you can do that if you've already plowed it back in the fall. Same thing. Agribusiness is right in there with everybody else.
What about use of chemical fertilizers? What does that do to the soil?
When you introduce chemical agriculture, the basic problem is that particularly a lot of the nitrogen-based chemical fertilizers tend to create a very blocky, hard soil structure. It becomes difficult for the soil to hold water and to maintain a structure that is fairly friable and easy for plant root systems to work with. And over time, it actually can make it increasingly difficult to plow, even. It's not unlike what we were talking about with the tropical laterites in some ways. The other thing that happens is that you, over time, begin to make it more and more difficult for other kinds of nutrients to be uptaken by the root systems. They tend to get trapped in the soil itself. There are many, many different things that happen when you introduce chemical fertilizers. A major impact is that much of the excess of the nitrogen and the phosphorus that we apply to soils washes off, goes into the streams, and becomes a major source of chemical pollution, which basically wipes out the flora and the fauna of the streams, and is another major source of organic pollution of our rivers. People don't recognize this either. But the thing I was going to say about the breadbasket is that this breadbasket, we're down from, let's say, 36 inches to perhaps an average of 10 inches in 100 years.
The soil.
Yeah. I mean, that's, let's say, a two-thirds loss.
Right.
Well, at current rates, we're talking about wiping out the agricultural foundation of our economy within, I'd say, between 25 and 50 years, depending on how we manage it.
I mean, it'll be basically a desert. Yeah. Our breadbasket will be a desert.
And I'm talking about just through erosion. And think about it.
I just did. I'm glad I'll be dead by then.
You don't hear this being talked about in the media very much. I mean, your show is one of the few I've ever been asked on to even mention the subject. We're into trendy things. I mean, Earth Day is an important initiative. Don't get me wrong. But, and it's very important to do things like recycling. But we are ignoring the fundamental core ecosystem issues.
What is it particularly that's polluting the air? What's causing ozone pollution and smog and air pollution and global warming trends? Obviously the air is part of this ecosystem that's under assault, just like the soil and the water.
Gosh, everything.
Everything.
If you think about it, we live in such a highly technological and industrial system that we're becoming increasingly dependent upon our, synthetic chairs. I mean, just look what we're wearing.
Yeah.
I try to wear natural cottons as much as possible, and I'm wearing shoes made of cork, but I still have a little rubber that's partly synthetic, cotton socks. If we just analyze ourselves and you start looking at what we're using and what we walk around with, this is organic in a sense. This is natural, Bisbee turquoise. It's quite astounding. I mean, right from our clothing right on out into our environment, we're increasingly living within a cultural ecosystem that sucks resources out of the natural ecosystem, calls it natural resources, converts it into stuff that we place value upon. And in the process of all the transformations that occur, particularly when we shift into things like synthetic plastics and many of all the different artificial kinds of chemicals that we've created, it's astounding. There's so many pollutants in the atmosphere at this point that I don't think we even have the tiniest clue of what each one of those chemicals is doing. When you take a look at the windblown fertilizers, the pesticides, all the trace poisons in the atmosphere from all the different kinds of chemical plants and different kinds of processing plants, and you take a look at then you look at the gross ozone release from the automobiles and the nitrogen and sulfuric acid releases. I lived in an area in southern Arizona that was being impacted with some of the heaviest SO2 pollution in the world from the copper smelters built by Phelps Dodge down there.
SO2 being?
It's the sulfuric acid base. And for about 7 years, my friends who were asthmatics, and several of them died. Babies were being born with in horrible condition, and people were walking around coughing, wheezing, phlegm coming out of their lungs every day of their life. It took myself and 2 others decided enough. And we had a series of strategy sessions in the early 80s, and we constructed a campaign to basically turn this around and close that smelter down, or the 3 smelters involved. And we then kicked off a campaign that drew tremendous local support groups. We had a group called GASP, and then it caught on a little more, got more attention from a few national organizations that joined in and helped. And eventually we actually closed the smelter. I think it was 2 years ago we closed the smelter down, but we had to have many very direct actions in front of that smelter, which is right on the Mexican border. Route 666 dead ends in that smelter, which the Christians will appreciate that. And we basically had a series of what we call die-ins, because at that time the EPA said it was acceptable to have
acceptable risk
to have 128 or 129 deaths in the immediate area that year. It was okay from the smelter. I mean, we shouldn't really put too much pressure on Phelps Dodge. We had a die-in where we went down and we had 128 people die in front of the smelter, and just to publicize that attitude and that value. Not to mention the fact that that smelter was the source of virtually all of the major source of acid rain for the entire Rocky Mountain region. That meant that the Rocky Mountain region only had a few years to go before the lakes and the forests began to die in the same way that the forests and the lakes of the Appalachians have already died.
In fact, let's focus now on...
So that was a unique opportunity for us to actually go in, take an action, and to take an action in a peaceful way, but basically a direct action which would hopefully get some results. And it actually did manage to turn things around. There's a lot that people can do if they're willing to be good ecological warriors with compassionate hearts.
They're finding the same thing now with nuclear plants, not even to mention the nuclear weapons that have been set off, the nuclear bomb testing that has occurred in the air in the past and the ground still. But now they're finding that the death rates and other health problems have skyrocketed just within the areas of nuclear plants. Similar to what you're talking about, but you can't see it, and it's difficult to measure, so they don't do anything about that.
Well, the nuclear level is that represents such a level of insanity. I find it almost impossible to conceive of that level of demonic force being consciously brought into the planet.
And that means nuclear energy as well as nuclear weapons.
Yes.
I mean, both of them have the same
Peaceful
destructive
use of
effect.
nuclear energy is a total
It's a fraud.
Fraud.
Right.
Because basically Emory Levins, an old friend of mine, did one of the best analyses of this process of anybody that I know. He runs a institute in the Rocky Mountains now for resource analysis, an excellent group. But in any case, Amory pointed out a number of years ago, after doing some very careful research, that the fundamental reason for building the nuclear power plants for peacetime use was to actually breed plutonium that could then be used for missiles. And this was the main purpose. And that all of the talk about low-cost electrical usage was a farce. Now, the other thing that nobody has taken into account with these nuclear plants, I mean, they don't work. They work for a few years, and then something generally will go wrong and closes them down. They're very inefficient. They're costly to build, and they're very inefficient. The cost of decommissioning a nuclear power plants has rarely been taken into account. And decommissioning costs, we now estimate, on the average, will run at least 2 to 3 times more than the cost of building the plant.
Gosh, it's insane.
Nobody has thought about those costs in terms of what we're handing on to our future generations. You know, what they will have to pay.
It's making profit today and then leaving the consequences for tomorrow. The federal deficit's another example of this mentality.
Yes. And if this is the case, I mean, well, it's awesome because we're talking about handing on a cost here that is going to be incredibly massive for the future, on top of all of the other burdens that we're passing along. And then we have on top of that things like Chernobyl, which happen, and those kinds of things are going to happen increasingly if we shift towards nuclear. I read recently that the cost of cleaning up Chernobyl will be in excess of $300 billion. That is, as I recall, about the size of our entire military budget in this country. That's just to clean up one nuclear power plant catastrophe. $300 billion. And people talk about peaceful use of nuclear energy as a wonderful alternative to fossil fuels and various other things. The thing is that when Reagan came into power, there was a man named Dennis Hayes, a close friend of mine, who was working for Solar Energy Research Institute in Colorado. He was building. He's now the chairperson for Earth Day. Interestingly enough, Dennis came out to visit and give a talk in Illinois just after the Reagan administration came in, and Dennis. When I saw Dennis at the airport, he looked kind of pale. I figured he had a hard time. Asked him what was wrong, and he said, "Well, I've been fired." And I said, "Well, what's going on?" And he said, "Well, the Reagan administration is going to dismantle and basically put out of business, except for a little bit of research, all solar energy initiatives in this country, and he's going to put in place atomic and nuclear energy initiatives." That man, Ronald Reagan, our great president, put us behind on environmental initiatives that could have really put us ahead. We could have gone ahead and prepared ourselves for an entry into the only kind of energy system that makes sense, which is renewable energy source. I mean, all the plants do it. They depend on the sun. We depend on it in almost every way if we think about it a little bit. Reagan put us behind it at least a decade, during a period when all the curves, the crisis curves, were going up at that rate. And I'm not sure we'll ever get past that period that he put us behind. The ignorance, the vast ignorance of that period, people do not realize. But it will come home to roost, and unfortunately in the near future. The only way to go is a good, strong renewable energy resource program, which depends on things like solar, wind, small mini hydro plants, and a variety of other sources that basically work with the energy of the earth and the energy of the sun.
And can that generate enough to keep up a sustainable standard of living?
Sure, easily.
John, we've talked about these various separate different things that are ecological disasters and big problems. We didn't even mention things like TV monitors and video display terminals, which they start kids in kindergarten and first grade. They radiate and can hurt people. I mean, they're kind of like mini nuclear plants in that sense. Well, the first question is, what can you tell us about that? And the second question is, of all these things we've talked about, they certainly must have some type of interactive, synergistic relationship which can make all these worse.
Right. Well, the electromagnetic pollution is a subject that interests me very much because it has been relatively ignored. I think we began to become aware of it when there was a lot of the use of it as a military weapon. I guess when the Russians were zapping the American embassy in Moscow. But in point of fact, electromagnetic pollution has become a major source of imbalance of the human body and the mind and the emotions in almost every American city. It's interesting that direct current tends to be a much smoother kind of electrical current than alternating current. Alternating current literally introduces a jerky vibration into the human body. It lives near those fields, and they're constantly going like this, and pretty soon you start literally kind of at a very subtle level doing that too. Now, if you live near high-tension power lines, high-tension is probably a good word for them, and you add on to that all of the different kinds of radio and television and all the different kinds of waves which are constantly bombarding us, my feeling is that it's having a major effect on the health of the energy body. We're just beginning to realize from studies in Chinese medicine, which again the American medical community would like to ignore, but unfortunately acupuncture is so well proven by now that they had to acknowledge that in fact there are energy flows. I'm having a treatment right now with an acupuncture, a couple of acupuncture points for a bad tooth. When they began to see that pain control was so effective with acupuncture, and they began to see that certain kinds of Qigong and Tai Chi movement exercises were so beneficial in the hospitals in China, they began to say, okay, there is something here, and maybe there is something to this theory of energy flow through the meridians of the body. The basic thing about electromagnetic pollution is that it completely imbalances the natural energy flow through those meridians of the body. And I'm convinced it's one of the sources of disease. I mean, disease is basically dis-ease, lack of full bodily and mental and emotional ease. And it seems like we've done everything possible to move out of that state. And maybe not intentionally, but if you think about it, the human organism evolved over millions of years in nature, surrounded by natural organic materials, eating fairly natural food like nuts and seeds and tubers and leafy shoots and things of that kind, probably some things from the edge of the sea. And then we were living with relatively organic materials on our bodies, with clean air and environments which were very close to nature. And that was the way it was for millions of years. We lived in relatively small, extended family environments and tribal environments, and we had people occasionally going out for periods of solo time to reconnect deeply with nature, and then we'd come back into the family. We're so far from that now I mean, everything in our life is totally artificial. And the urban industrial era has only been with us for, what, several hundred years. If you were to take a look at the tendency of human beings on the planet, how long we've been here, and that was an hour on a clock, this urban industrial culture is just a tiny, tiny fraction of a second before midnight. And we're using this. We assume that this is the standard. As if, this is the way it always was, and this is the way it always will be. That's a vast illusion. And this culture is not sustainable. It will not last. It is on the way out. The question is, what will replace it? What will replace it depends entirely on the actions that we take now and in the future. And it's one of the reasons that the ecological awakening is so important. But the main point I wanted to make is that our whole being, our emotions, our body, our mind, evolved or co-evolved with the organic system and fabric of life of the planet over millions of years. In a few hundred years, we replaced that with a totally synthetic and artificial existence. How can we possibly expect to be healthy, emotionally, mentally, or physically? It is no accident we're having diseases that are breakdowns of the immune system, breakdowns of the basic cellular system, like cancer. Cancer is behaving like we are. It is simply
growth out of control.
It's the reflection in our bodies of what we've become in relation to the planet. So if you think about it, cancer is a cell that it does not regulate itself. It grows without any control. The cancer spreads, it kills you. It kills the body. In a similar way, it has greed. It only wants to consume the resources of the rest of the organs of the body, the organ systems of the body. It doesn't care. It just wants to grow without limit. The human being, and it kills us. The human being is growing on the planet with no regard for all the organ systems of the planet, for Mother Gaia. It grows without any limit. It will grow until the planet is dead. That is how we are actually behaving. So, of course, our bodies are now reflecting cancer, which is simply the natural microcosmic reflection of our behavior, the behavior that we're inflicting upon Mother Earth herself. So, to talk about synergy, which was your other question, synergy, by the way, means synergy is where you look at the total net of the interrelated effects of all the different actions and reactions of something. And you may have, let's say, a cumulative effect of, we have in our environment stresses coming in from driving to work for 2 hours a day and beating on the steering wheel. I was talking to somebody who was a mechanic recently working with air conditioning units, and I saw him down in Baja driving a Toyota, and he said, I said, what were you doing up there in California? He said, well, I used to repair air conditioning units in San Diego, and I liked it. And I said, well, why'd you leave? And he said, well, too many years of driving on those freeways that got bigger and bigger and more stressed out. And I began to see people literally going crazy on the road. They're pounding. You hear about the shootings. But what you don't hear about is the thousands, if not millions of people screaming, pounding on the steering wheel, or trying to bottle it all up inside. You don't hear so much about that. But that's what's going on. And you take that kind of stress, you add it to chemical pollutants, you add it to pesticides, you add it to poor nutrition, and so on. And the cumulative impact of all that, taken together, is synergistic. That means that when you add one kind of toxin to another toxin, you get something usually that's far more toxic than just the one thing alone. Most of our tests of the effect of environmental pollutants or poisons of one kind or another, be it a physiological stress or a literal toxin, chemical toxin, is single factor analysis. It means that we don't look at the total system and the total range of impacts that are working on that system simultaneously, as they actually do in nature, in the actual world. And through this single factor analysis, the EPA and the various standards of government set their standards for what's allowable in terms of a pollutant, for example. There's no interest in finding out what the sum total of all that is. If you took each one of those impacts and took a look at the impact of that on a human being or an animal, another kind of animal, I should say, there's no question that the cumulative impact would be far greater than the single factor alone. Far, far greater. A quantum shift greater. And we are not measuring for that. Nowhere in government, nowhere in science. And yet that's what's actually going on. It's amazing.
And now we want to talk about what we can do, what we must do in order to prevent all these catastrophes, or less, maybe Homo sapien isn't worth it. Maybe we should just, shuffle off and give things back to the good animals of the world. But anyway, if we're going to do something, I guess we have to look at Earth in a different way than we have in the past. And you have, and some other people are doing this, aren't you?
Yeah, I think some really hopeful signs. One of the things that has particularly interested me is the growth, on the one hand, of a different philosophical view of what the human being is and what the Earth is, and the relationship of the human being to the Earth, and also to the matter, the mother, mater, the Earth that we live with right here in our bodies. And there's a new, a friend of mine, Jim Lovelock, has been working for some years with a close friend of his. They came up with a theory entitled the Gaia hypothesis several years ago.
Gaia?
Yes, Gaia.
How do you spell that?
I think it's G-A-I-A.
G-A-I-A.
And basically, this hypothesis says that the Earth is behaving like a living organism. And that may sound a little radical to those people that are thinking about the Earth as basically just a bunch of stuff out there, a resource system that you go and exploit, and you pull stuff in and you transform it into your BMW. But in point of view, the Earth has been here much longer than we have. It gave birth to us and our species. We've been here maybe a couple million years. The Earth has been here for billions and billions of years. And we don't really know what the Earth is. It's a great mystery. We have something that we call science. But just imagine if our whole culture were a little cluster of cells somewhere down on the left side of the liver. And that little cluster of cells was trying to figure out, what is this that I'm living within? Huh? It would be very difficult. It would probably, particularly if it was a series of cancer cells living on the liver and starting to grow, it would probably view the rest of this body that it was living within and on as simply a rather convenient kind of mass of organic stuff to utilize and extract stuff from for its own growth. And then it would put together a philosophical system that would, fit that view of unlimited growth and sort of an egocentric view of the species. Now, the ecocentric view basically says that, well, the Earth is a living organism. It's alive, just as the human body is. It's a vast body of which we are part. We're cells in that great body. All the living beings in that body have different roles and interrelationships that play a part within that great body of Mother Earth. Some of them are acting like different tissues. Some of them are acting like different organs of the body. Like the tropical rainforests and the oceans are producing the oxygen and helping to uptake some of the carbon dioxide and maintain the atmospheric cycles and the rainfall cycles, and so on and so forth. Basically, the self-regulating behavior of the whole planet so that all life is supported is what Gaia is all about and what the Gaia hypothesis is all about. The original idea came about when they discovered that the oxygen levels of the planet were exactly maintained at that level, that if it went any higher, if you had a forest fire, you could not put it out. It would everything would combust. If it went down below that level that it's at, we wouldn't have enough to respire properly. And somehow, over millennia, it has maintained a perfect oxygen equilibrium for the perfect maintenance of all the different species of the Earth. And when Lovelock took a look at all the different possible mechanisms for this, he came to the conclusion that the only way the Earth could do this is through a basic self-regulation system that would be just like how the human body self-regulates itself to maintain the equilibrium and the homeostasis and stability of the body, as well as the growth of the overall body. Well, this is a revolutionary idea, of course. Then they went ahead and began to examine that principle, that hypothesis, in light of evolutionary theory. And they found the same thing began to hold true. Again and again, they found examples within evolutionary biology that basically pointed to the same truth, that the Earth was behaving like a living organism. So suddenly we're beginning to move into a view that says, is saying something very different than what our forefathers said, that the Earth is just a dead thing. But interestingly enough, with a few species living on it, that happen to be, through survival of the fittest and all that kind of craziness, doing what they're doing. We've never really given much attention to the interconnectedness of life, the symbiotic, cooperative nature of life. But of course, it probably began in a fairly small way and then somehow managed to grow out into this rather amazingly interconnected and mutually supporting system. And cooperation probably has been about at least 90% of that process. And there's competition in there too. But competition is just the flip side of cooperation. The two are completely intertwined, just like the yin is a part of the yang and the yang is a part of the yin. So, in a sense, I think for the first time we're beginning to look at life as and of the Earth itself as a vast organic being whose intelligence there's no way to even begin to even speak of that, because it's beyond us. It's beyond us to know what that is or isn't. But what we can say is that the living processes of the Earth, the flow of, you might say, of the life force through the organ systems and the tissues of the planet are definitely behaving just like a body.
Of course, now the Earth evolved itself. How does this hypothesis fit into the various stages of the Earth?
The evolution of the Earth. That's a very interesting question, because it occurred to me the other day that, where does the human being fit into all of this? Are we destined just to be cancer? Are we the Earth's cancer? Is that it? It's an interesting question. And if we take a little more optimistic view, some people would say, oh no, we may be the cancer now, but actually we're destined to be the intelligence of the planet. I love that one. If we were truly the intelligence of the planet, I doubt we would become the cancer of the planet. I think it's more likely that we represent a highly developed ego structure for the planet. You might say we're the planetary ego. We're the sense of separate self. We're the part of the planet that can say, we are here and everything else is out there.
Subjectivity.
Yeah.
But that's more the principle of modernity, starting around the Renaissance and the era of capitalism and Protestantism.
Right, tied in with that.
That also, at that time, the vision of the human as the master of the earth.
Exactly.
Which you have also in the Bible.
Right.
The command to go and master and conquer the earth.
Have dominion.
Right, dominion over
Right.
all of the fields and flowers,
Right.
etc.
The interesting thing is that if we look on ourselves as the development of the ego structure for planet Earth, which is my personal theory, it may be that the next phase for Earth, since we've been caught up in being very egotistical for quite a while, and manifesting that new exploration of what Earth herself is, and exploring that for Earth, maybe the next step is actually to join with other, really the step beyond, which is where the ego structure begins to see how, yes, there is separation and self-identification, but there is also tremendous interconnectedness, also a level of indivisibility, and a level at which we're all one great being again. And obviously, most interestingly, if we are to survive as a species, or maybe if the Earth herself is to survive, at least in the organic richness that she now manifests, we may have to go through that transition into valuing all the species and all of life in the same way that we value our own life and the life of our own species. In other words, we'll have to make that philosophical leap and give that same value to other forms of life that we give to our own, if we're actually going to survive ourselves.
Well, that's a curious thing. Do you think that Homo sapiens is the first species that has a parasitic relationship with Mother Earth rather than symbiotic? And is this a fatal flaw?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, we've had so many other species that have been here and gone extinct, like the various dinosaur species and so on. But I think we can say that there are other systems of vast intelligence on the planet right now. I've spent a lot of time with the whales and the dolphins, and there's no question that those animals are beings of tremendous intelligence. When you think about a frontal brain system that we identify with rational consciousness and intelligence that is so much larger and vaster than ours that you can put the brain of some of those things, it would fill an entire pickup truck compared to our brain.
And their communication system is so incredibly complex.
Exactly.
If that alone is an indication of intelligence, and they're vastly superior to us.
The feeling I've often got from spending time with the whales down in Baja, where I do these wilderness solos, is that their intelligence is, I guess an analogy would be to say it's like a galactic level awareness. Of course, the dolphins, the porpoises are extremely intelligent too, but they're a little more, I have the feeling, a little more accessibility somehow. There's a tremendous open-heartedness to the whales and the dolphins both. When they come in, when folks go out and do a wilderness solo down there, and we've been doing these solos so that people can make a deeper connection with nature directly.
Getting out by themselves.
Getting out by themselves and basically spending 7 days after 3 days of doing some awareness training together, and then they go out for 7 days. They're completely alone but comfortable. And they stay completely present, working with their senses to connect deeply with the truth of what's in the environment without any theory, just experiencing. And what they experience is, particularly for some of the political and social leaders that have gone through this process, is absolutely amazing. One man went through this recently. He was leader of a major technological university publishing house. And when he came back, his entire view of what the world was, what Earth is, the organic quality of Earth, the organic beingness of Earth, and his place in it had changed. And he has started up a major ecological publishing magazine, and is going to host 2 major conferences on Gaia through this university, which up until now has been largely focused on technology and industrial development. That's the kind of impact that a direct connection without any particular theories with Mother Earth can have if you just go direct. And that's, of course, the kind of thing that the Native Americans did through their vision quest. And I think it's no accident that the Native Americans, because they had the vision quest, were able to cultivate it. They would go out at least once in a lifetime, and usually 3 or 4 times, or the medicine people would go out sometimes once a year. And because that direct perception linked them with levels of truth that one can only know by going through the experience. Out of that truth came the kinds of values we talked about in the last program, which said we will make no major changes in the Earth and in our local Earth unless we know that it will be beneficial to all of our children and all beings out to the 7th generation. That's a value system that really understands the workings of the planet and honors it. So the reason we've been doing these wilderness solo programs is to basically reintroduce that kind of a process into our culture so that we can create a different kind of value system which will have that kind of a organic wholeness to it.
And John, what kind of practical ecological measures come out of the Gaia philosophy to preserve our Earth? We talked earlier of the pollution and depletion of the air, of the soil, of the water, of the oceans. What sorts of measures does this sort of philosophical meditation lead to preserve these aspects of our natural environment?
Some people call this deep ecology. I prefer just to call it the ecological view, or in a sense it's a sacred view, because you have a tremendously sacred feeling about life after you go through this kind of experience. What happens is you no longer can view your own life or the life of the other beings of the planet as something apart from you. You literally feel connected to everything. It's not to say that you're totally caught up in unity, but it's to say that you feel completely interconnected. You feel the relationship with all beings. And you begin to perceive all beings as having meaning and direct relationship to you, and you to them. Again, it becomes more like family. Now, when you begin to have a relationship like family with all the different beings of the earth, your values shift. When your values shift, then you begin to place priority on things like, well, if I build a power plant down here, or I'm going to put a nuclear power plant over here, or I'm going to put an industry over there that's polluting the river, it's going to kill all my brothers and sisters who live in that river. It's going to kill part of me, what I'm connected to, part of my family. The Native Americans called the plants, and they had the four-leggeds and the winged people and the stone people, and they saw everything in that way as family. I feel that this kind of a process, particularly for widespread and a basic part of our education, the Wilderness Solo or the Vision Quest, that it would completely change the way in which we relate to nature, and that all of our laws, all of our the way that we create technology would shift. We would then say, well, obviously we're going to have technologies that work in harmony with the whole fabric of life. That's important, that we value that. We place that just as important as social security.
John, we only have about 10 minutes, and we want to talk about what needs to be done. We've talked about a need to change philosophically, but the world isn't a very philosophical place. When you talk about multinational corporations and capitalism and banks and social Eastern Europe and the governments they've had there, Stalinism, all just destroying the earth for power and profits and production. From the things you've told us last time, we're facing incredible disasters. We must take enormous steps immediately, I would assume.
There's a lot of levels for hope. I personally feel that one of the best things that people can do is to take direct action in their own lives on issues that they have a direct relationship with. I mentioned last time that the work that we did to stop a major copper smelter in Arizona that was directly polluting the air of everyone in southern Arizona. Everyone living in this country has issues directly affecting them in their lives today. And I'm a strong advocate of taking direct action to make the changes. If government is resistant to the kinds of changes that need to be made, get together with your friends and take a direct action. Go ahead and chain yourself to a bulldozer if necessary. The main thing is when you take a direct action and you make a statement like that, a very strong statement, and put your life on the line, if you do that, is to keep a good, compassionate heart. A good ecological warrior has a loving heart. Gandhi always honored and respected his opponents and saw the basic humanity of them underneath. But he was a warrior at the same time. He took the courageous action. He put his life on the line where necessary. And I'm saying this because I feel that ecological activism is on the rise. People are really fed up. And there's a danger that activism could fall into the pit of becoming filled with anger and hatred. Then we would just be in the situation of Lebanon or the Middle East, where you have all the factionalism and the fundamentalism, and the hatred only feeds on itself. So it's very important for activists to radiate compassion and love to their opponents. At the same time, they're taking the action. There needs to be a real understanding. It's not easy if you're sitting there chained to a tree and the logger is coming at you with a chainsaw with hate in his eyes. But it's good practice. At another level, there are many actions that people can take. In your everyday life, there are all kinds of shifts that you can make to bring solar energy into your home, to bring recycling into your household, to bring a reduction, a simpler lifestyle into your life. If you live more simply, you'll have lower taxes, you'll have fewer worries, you'll have fewer possessions to worry about. I'm amazed when people go out and solo. The one thing they tell me consistently is, and when I go back, John, I'm going to simplify my life tremendously, because I realize for the first time that I really don't need very much to be happy. Because these people go out with basically nothing and spend a week with nothing and realize that they're blissfully happy just being in nature with nothing. So why do they tie themselves up in knots back in the cities to support all this stuff, which is making them unhappy, basically? They're suffering as a result of their stuff. So it only makes sense that you simplify your stuff and you boil it down to a more essentialized form of living that's in harmony with nature, and reduce your consumption. If we could reduce our consumption, we could dramatically reduce our impact on the environment. The United States is consuming probably close to half the world's resources. We have, what, 5% of the world's population?
I've seen estimates as high as 60%.
Yeah.
The world's resources.
Yeah.
What about on the sort of national and even global level? These environmental problems are global. Mm-hmm. The air, the water, the earth, all of these ecological systems are interconnected. So what can people do to stop pollution on a more national level?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing, give you another sort of practical example, there are some very good organizations doing important work. Rainforest Action Network out in San Francisco is an excellent group working on the tropical forest issues. Our Threshold Foundation has something called the Environmental Crisis Fund. And the philosophy behind that is to basically have people tithe a portion of their salary, their gross salary. And then that salary, maybe 5% of their gross salary, goes directly into environmental crises where a small amount of money can have a powerful impact. Usually, if you're trying to get a grant for a project, you may sit back and try to get that money for a year if you're going through a federal agency or a major foundation. Very often, a rainforest is lost before you can raise the money to do anything about it. So we thought it was important to have a fund that could immediately provide cash immediately to help support flying, for example, a rainforest person, perhaps a tribal elder from the rainforest, to testify before a congressional hearing in Congress. Maybe an appropriations committee meeting that's being called on whether or not to give a big hunk of money to the World Bank to build a dam that will flood the rainforest where that man lives. And it has to be done within a week. So you can put your own energy, your work, and your help towards those kinds of outfits. And you can certainly help them through your financing. I think it's very appropriate to tithe yourself and help out the environmental organizations that are doing such hard work today. When you look at the amount of money going into all of the other often very socially questionable causes, and you look at the poverty of the environmental movement, I think it's about time we at least tithed ourselves 5 or 10% for the earth.
And is there enough of an environmental movement to save the environment at this stage in history?
It's building. I don't think we're anywhere close to having a sufficiently powerful movement to solve what's ahead of us. That's why I'm saying we have to really get to work.
We don't have the power. The people who have the power are the ones who are benefiting in the short term from exploiting the earth and destroying it. Are these people getting an increased sense of consciousness?
In a few cases, perhaps. But there's a tendency for folks that have a lot of power to hold on to their power at any cost. And my own feeling is that at this point in time, we have to put tremendously strong pressure on all of the channels of of change in government. in order to-
Corporations, government. George Bush claims he's the environmental president. In the earlier show, you critiqued Ronald Reagan for his disastrous ecological policies. Do you see any shift in Bush, or is this just rhetoric?
I think Bush is a much more adroit politician. And he basically reads the currents of and the winds of change, says the right thing, and then does what he really wants to do behind the scenes.
Which is to develop corporate...
For example, I saw in the paper today that yesterday he made a big pronouncement about how wonderful Earth Day was. The next day, what did the Interior Department do? It went out and announced that it was opening up a whole new spectrum of oil leasing opportunities along our coasts. I mean, what does that tell you? Judge the man by his actions, not by his words.
What would be your final message to the American people out there?
Place the environment first in your life, at least for the next 20 years. Make that number one. And put your energy, a good hunk of your time, and tithe yourself some of your money, your income, to put directly towards turning things around and the creation of an ecologically sustainable society, and not just helping your own immediate life in your neighborhood and your town and your county and your state, your region, and your bioregion, but also putting something into helping the global issues of tropical deforestation, the tremendous destruction of the oceans which is upon us. I mean, we're just beginning to address the tremendous loss of the oxygen-producing plankton that we have on the oceans. We're seeing the need for having all of our fleets of oil tankers, I think, triple-hulled, not just double-hulled. And we need to do something about the unbelievable overfishing